The day of Robert's funeral was quiet. A soft rain had fallen that morning, as if the sky was mourning alongside me. The chapel was small and filled with muted sobs, the kind that broke through tight throats and clenched jaws. Everyone wore their best, but their eyes looked tired, not just from grief, but from life itself. I stood by the casket with my hands folded tightly in front of me, not because I needed something to do with them, but because I didn't know how to let go. Robert had been my husband for 40 years. 40 years of morning coffees, silent car rides, soft laughter during bad TV shows, arguments about nothing, and apologies that came with a hand on my back before bedtime. He had been more than my partner. He was the voice that made me feel safe, even when I didn't say a word. When the service ended, people lined up to offer their condolences. Some genuinely kind, others stiff and unsure. I don't remember much of what anyone said. I nodded, I hugged, I thanked. I was the grieving widow. The role I never rehearsed but now had to perform. Then Melissa stepped forward. My daughter, my only child. 35, sharply dressed, not a single strand of hair out of place. Her expression was composed, her tears brief and efficient. She hugged me, light as a whisper. I could smell her perfume. Something expensive, sterile, cold. And then, as she pulled back and looked down at the casket, she leaned in just slightly and said, "Can I have Dad's watch?" Just like that. No. I miss him. No. Are you okay, Mom? No. What a beautiful service. Just the watch. The watch. Robert wore that watch every single day for the last 20 years, a silver Omega with a worn leather strap. It wasn't about the brand or the money. It was about the meaning. He'd gotten it after selling his first business, and he wore it every anniversary, every birthday, even on hospital visits. It had his initials engraved on the back. That watch had been on his wrist the day we danced in the kitchen to Nat King Cole for no reason at all. It was on him when he held our newborn daughter for the first time. And now, it sat on our dresser, waiting to be touched, and I hadn't even had the courage to move it. I blinked. My mouth stayed shut. She smiled faintly like she'd asked about a leftover casserole. It just means a lot to me. I nodded. Not yes, not number. Just a nod, because in that moment my brain didn't know how to do anything else. I felt the world tilt slightly, like I'd stepped onto a moving walkway that no longer matched my pace. And then, before I could gather a single thought, her husband Gavin walked up behind her, hand on her back, and said something about probate and timelines. I didn't catch it. I was too busy trying to swallow the feeling rising up in my chest like boiling water. They moved on, chatting with someone from the funeral home about forms and deadlines. I stood there, alone, even in a room full of people. Robert had always said Melissa had her own way of showing care. Not through words or softness, but through logic and responsibility. But this wasn't care. This was calculation. And in that quiet, unbearable moment, I realized something. Robert was barely cold in the ground, and my daughter was already dividing his life into pieces. Not out of grief, not out of nostalgia, but out of ownership. A switch flipped, not loudly, not with a scream or a slam of the hand, but something irreversible moved inside me. The funeral ended, and people filtered out into the gray afternoon. I stayed behind, placing one trembling hand on the edge of Robert's casket. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I think I need to do something you didn't see coming." That was the last time I ever stood in that chapel, but it was the first time I truly understood the weight of being alone and the dangerous clarity that sometimes comes with it. I didn't answer Melissa's question at the funeral. I nodded, a reflex, not consent, and walked away. Not toward anyone, not with any purpose. I just moved because standing still felt unbearable. No one noticed, or if they did, no one said anything. Everyone was too wrapped in their own rituals of grief, chatting about Robert's life, hugging with forced compassion, whispering about what comes next. But inside me, something had gone quiet. Too quiet. I sat in the back of the funeral home as people began to trickle out. My hands trembled, so I clasped them together again. I stared ahead, not seeing anyone, not hearing anything. All I could think about was that moment, that single sentence. Can I have Dad's watch? Like we were standing at a garage sale, like I hadn't just buried the man who held my hand through every illness, every miscarriage, every life change. And the worst part? It wasn't what she said, it was how she said it, with ease, with calculation, with expectation. She expected me to hand it over just like that, because in her mind, he was gone. The chapter was over. The estate, the assets, the heirlooms. That was what came next. That was the real event, not the mourning, not the memory. I pressed my nails into the palm of my hand, trying to anchor myself. I didn't cry. Not then. I couldn't. Instead, my mind began to float backward. I thought of Melissa at 10 years old, brushing her Barbie's hair at the foot of our bed while Robert read the newspaper. She used to say she wanted to marry someone just like her daddy. And now, here she was, married to Gavin, a man who once joked that estate planning is just early retirement for the living. I used to laugh along with them. I used to think it was harmless, that they were just ambitious. Now I wasn't so sure. When we returned to the house later that evening, Melissa didn't stay long. She hugged me again briskly and said, "Call me if you need anything." Then she added, "And when you get a chance, can you set aside some of Dad's personal things? I don't want them to get lost in the shuffle." I nodded again, still silent, still hollow. They left, and the house fell into that unbearable stillness only widows understand. When every creak sounds louder, every clock tick feels rude, and even your own footsteps seem to echo with absence. I sat down in Robert's chair, the leather still warm from the sun, and I did nothing. I didn't turn on the TV, I didn't scroll my phone. I just stared at the fireplace mantel, where our wedding photo still stood. Robert in his navy blue suit, me in a simple cream dress, his hand resting gently over mine. I tried to remember how it felt to be loved like that. Then I looked across the room at the hallway where Melissa had walked so confidently earlier that day. She'd looked around like she already owned the place, like everything here was just waiting for her to catalog and claim. And I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't expected. Not sadness, not anger, resolve. I didn't scream at her. I didn't throw her out. I simply let the silence grow inside me like a stone. Heavy, deliberate. Because this wasn't just about the watch. This was about what that question revealed. That Melissa, my own daughter, didn't see my grief. She saw an opportunity. And if that was true, what else had she seen? What else had she already taken? What plans had she and Gavin already put into motion while I was still sleeping next to Robert in a hospital bed, hoping he'd recover? I didn't know yet, but I was going to find out. For now, I didn't react. I didn't fight. I let the silence wrap around me like armor, because some battles aren't won by speaking first. They're won by waiting, watching. And when the moment comes, striking with truth. The house didn't feel the same after Robert's funeral. It was as if someone had turned down the warmth by a few invisible degrees. Not cold exactly, just unfamiliar. I walked from room to room that night, aimlessly. Our home had always been a place of order, filled with little habits. A mug beside the kettle, his slippers by the front door, the paper folded neatly on the table. Now everything looked frozen in time, a display of what life used to be. The grief wasn't loud. It didn't come in waves. It sat in my bones like cement, heavy, still. And then there was Melissa. I kept replaying her words. "Can I have Dad's watch?" It looped in my mind like a song I couldn't turn off. The more I thought about it, the more I began to feel like a stranger in my own life. That simple question had exposed something deeper, something far more disturbing than selfishness, entitlement, That's what it was. She spoke like someone who had already decided what parts of Robert's life belonged to her, as if I were just the temporary gatekeeper. I tried to sleep, but every creak in the house made my heart thump. I got up at 3 a.m. and sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea that I never drank. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was watchful. I opened the drawer where Robert used to keep bills and paperwork just to touch the familiar things. There were envelopes with his handwriting, sticky notes with little reminders. Renew car tags. Call Irene's dentist. Check Melissa's tax prep. He always took care of the details. I handled birthdays, holidays, the human stuff. He handled the infrastructure of our lives. Now it was mine to manage, alone. I pushed the drawer shut. Too fast. The utensils clinked loudly, making me flinch. I remembered a moment from a few weeks before Robert passed. He had been in bed, weak but alert. I had sat beside him, and we had held hands for nearly an hour without speaking. Then, out of nowhere, he had said, "I trust you to do what's right when I'm gone. Don't let anyone push you." At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental. Now, I wondered if he had seen something I hadn't. Melissa had always been practical, yes. But had Robert noticed her circling? Had he heard the way Gavin talked about preparing for the future a little too eagerly? I found myself walking down the hallway toward our bedroom, but I stopped short when I passed the guest room, Melissa's old room. The door was slightly ajar. I reached for the knob, then pulled my hand back. The last time she stayed here was months ago, when Robert's condition had worsened. She had insisted she wanted to help, but I remember clearly how she spent more time on her laptop than with him. I remembered hearing her and Gavin whispering in the hallway late at night, their voices low but urgent, something about paperwork and timing. I had assumed it was work-related. Now, I wasn't so sure. By morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Not just emotionally, but practically. Robert had always kept a thick brown folder labeled Important Docs in his desk. I hadn't touched it yet. I didn't want to, but I felt this quiet urge building, not from paranoia, but from instinct. What if there was more to Melissa's question than I had realized? What if the watch was just her first reach, not her last? I went into the bedroom. The folder was still there, tucked neatly beneath a stack of tax forms. I pulled it out and set it on the bed. My hands hovered over the clasp. I didn't open it, not yet. Instead, I looked at Robert's nightstand. The watch was still there, resting in its usual spot, face up, timeless. I picked it up gently. The leather was soft, worn from years of wear. I turned it over. His initials, still etched into the back, RJM. I pressed it to my palm. Melissa wanted this watch, but something in my heart told me she wanted more, and she thought I wouldn't notice. But I had, and now I couldn't unsee it. The home I once trusted had become a place of quiet doubt, and I knew. Before I did anything else, I needed to know what Robert had left behind, not just the money, the truth. I waited until late afternoon, after the house had gone completely quiet, to open the brown folder Robert kept in his desk. I sat on the edge of the bed, the folder in my lap, my heart thudding like I was trespassing in someone else's life. But this was mine and his. And now it was mine alone. When I opened the clasp, the first thing I saw was Robert's handwriting, a yellow sticky note taped to the inside cover, slightly faded and bent at the corners. If you're reading this, I'm not around anymore. Check everything. Melissa's been asking strange questions. My breath caught. My fingers trembled. I reread that sentence 3 times. This wasn't grief-driven paranoia. Robert had noticed something too. He had sensed it before I did. I turned the pages carefully. Inside were copies of every important document, updated wills, property deeds, insurance policies, even an offshore account I had no idea existed. Everything was marked, labeled, dated. He had quietly restructured his entire estate. and all of it was under my name. Not Melissa's, not Gavin's, mine. I paused at a legal document filed just 6 months ago, a revised will that removed Melissa as the secondary beneficiary. Robert had originally left portions of his business shares and savings for her in the event of my death, but that clause had been revoked. Instead, the language was clear. All primary assets, real estate and financial accounts are to remain solely with my wife, Irene Mallory. No conditional transfers to family members unless stipulated by Irene. I placed the paper down slowly, afraid even to wrinkle it. Why hadn't he told me any of this directly? We shared everything, or so I thought. But then I remembered how tired he had looked in those final months, how little he spoke unless it truly mattered. I remembered one night in particular when Melissa and Gavin had left after a visit. Robert had watched them pull out of the driveway, then turned to me and said, "Sometimes I think people mistake planning for love." I hadn't known what he meant. Now I did. Suddenly, I remembered a conversation I overheard a few weeks before the funeral. Melissa had been in the kitchen, talking on the phone in that clipped, efficient tone she used when she thought no one was listening. She had said, "If she doesn't move out within the year, we'll need to push harder." The lawyer said she's fragile right now, so timing is key. At the time, I had assumed she was talking about helping me move into a smaller home or retirement facility. Now the words felt different. Now they felt calculated. I flipped further through the folder and found another note tucked behind the life insurance policy. It was just one line, in Robert's messy all-caps handwriting. "Do not trust Gavin with the house." That was all. No explanation. Just a warning. I stared at the note, and the past year started unraveling in my head. The way Gavin had always offered to handle the paperwork when Robert got sick. How Melissa kept suggesting I sell the house before the market shifts. Their eagerness to help me set up online banking, consolidate bills, streamline everything. It wasn't generosity. It was groundwork. They weren't supporting me. They were studying me, preparing for life without Robert, and more importantly, for life with everything he'd left behind. But Robert had been a step ahead. He'd trusted me, not just with his love, but with the defense of his legacy, and I hadn't even known. I set the folder down, stood up, and walked slowly to the front door. I opened it and looked at the driveway, remembering how Melissa had leaned against the car that morning after the funeral, sunglasses on, asking casually about estate procedures. She thought I was soft. She thought I was passive. She thought she'd already won. But now I knew better. And knowing gave me power. I wasn't going to confront her. Not yet. That would tip my hand. I needed to learn more, protect what was mine, build a wall she couldn't see, let alone climb. I wasn't just grieving anymore. I was waking up. The next morning, I called Denise. She and I had taught at the same high school for nearly 20 years. Even after retirement, we met every other week for coffee, usually to swap book recommendations or rant about politics. But this call wasn't casual. My voice cracked the moment she answered. "Can we meet?" I asked. "Today, somewhere quiet." She didn't ask questions. She just said yes. We met at a small diner 2 towns over, the kind of place where the waitress knew your name and didn't rush you out after 1 cup of coffee. I slid into the booth and handed her the manila folder Robert had left behind. Denise took one look at my face and knew this wasn't about grief anymore. For the next hour, I laid it all out. What Melissa said at the funeral, the notes Robert had left me, the overheard conversations, the will, everything. Denise didn't interrupt. She just flipped through the documents with practiced eyes. When she reached the note that said, "Do not trust Gavin with the house," she nodded grimly. "Smart man," she muttered. I finally exhaled. "I thought I was just being paranoid," I said, wrapping my hands around my mug to keep them from shaking. "But now I think they've been circling for months, waiting for Robert to die. Maybe even trying to push me out before I'm ready." Denise leaned in. You're not wrong, and you're not crazy. They're vultures, Irene. Polished, well-spoken, well-dressed vultures. But vultures just the same. I swallowed hard. What do I do? I asked. She tapped the folder. You do exactly what Robert asked. You protect yourself. You get ahead of them. You make sure they can't touch a penny you don't want them to have. That afternoon, Denise connected me with one of her friends, a quiet, sharp estate attorney named Carla who had worked with widows before. Carla didn't waste time with sympathy. She dove straight into strategy. First, she helped me secure all joint accounts in my name only, including the overseas account in Belize I hadn't even known existed. Robert had opened it years ago, possibly anticipating this exact situation. Then we reviewed the will. It was airtight. The revised version removed any obligation to Melissa. There were no equal division clauses, no vague phrases that could be twisted. Carla smiled when she saw it. Your husband was smart and protective. This isn't just financial planning. This is defense. Still, Carla warned me, Melissa may not have a legal leg to stand on, but that won't stop her from trying. She might challenge the will, or she might do what these types usually do. Manipulate, guilt, pressure you, pretend they're just helping while setting up the groundwork for a hostile takeover. I nodded. So how do I stop them without a war? Carla folded her hands and looked at me seriously. You don't engage. You smile. You thank them for their help. You act just disoriented enough that they believe you're still processing. And while they're watching your right hand, you move everything with your left. I didn't recognize the woman I had become by the end of that meeting. I wasn't just a grieving widow anymore. I was the keeper of a man's legacy, and the only one standing between what he built and the people trying to strip it down. That night, I returned home and called Melissa. I kept my voice soft even. I told her I was going through some paperwork and might need help organizing it soon. She perked up immediately. Of course, Mom. I can come by with Gavin this weekend if that helps, just to get things sorted. I agreed. That would be lovely. I smiled after I hung up. She thought she was walking into an easy handover, a grieving mother, a quiet house. What she didn't know was that everything was already in motion. The accounts, the legal protections, the escape route. She thought she still had time to circle, but I was done standing still. The day Melissa came by the house, she brought her usual calm smile and 2 lattes. Vanilla, no sugar, she said, handing me one as she stepped inside like she owned the place. Gavin followed, cheerful as ever, nodding at every photo on the wall like it was the first time he'd noticed them. I played the role I knew they expected, worn down, still in mourning, still sorting through emotions and paperwork with a foggy head. Oh, I haven't even touched anything in Robert's office, I murmured. It's just been too hard. Melissa gave my shoulder a gentle squeeze. That's okay, Mom. We'll help you figure it all out. There's no rush. But it's better to be organized sooner than later, right? I nodded, taking a sip of the latte I had no intention of drinking. For the next hour, they wandered from room to room, opening drawers and commenting on how Dad would have wanted things to be simple. Gavin suggested that maybe we should think about selling the house. It's a lot for one person to manage, you know? I gave him a sad smile and said, That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that yet. But I had. I'd already thought about everything. By the time they walked through that door, I had transferred all Robert's financial assets to my name, updated account passwords, and locked out all secondary users, consulted with Carla, who had filed a restriction with the county clerk to prevent any property transfers without my explicit consent, moved the contents of Robert's safe deposit box, including his vintage watch, to a new bank and locked it under a code no one knew, secured the deed to the house under a legal trust in my name only. Melissa and Gavin had no idea, and I planned to keep it that way. They walked through the house that day like sharks circling a slow swimmer, but I wasn't bleeding. I was baiting. I pretended not to notice Melissa making a mental list of items. which ones she wanted, which ones she'd sell, which ones would just clutter up her house. I caught her glancing at my ring, Robert's old leather bag, his books, his cufflinks. They were already dividing a life that wasn't theirs. When they left that afternoon, Melissa gave me another light hug and said, "You know, when you're ready, I'd love to go through Dad's office with you. There might be things I want to hold on to. For the memories." I smiled and nodded. "That would be nice." Then I shut the door and bolted it. Over the next week, I played my role to perfection. I responded to Melissa's texts slowly, answered Gavin's calls with vague updates, and occasionally hinted at being overwhelmed with all the decisions. Meanwhile, I met quietly with Carla again. We finalized the restructuring of Robert's overseas account. I opened a new bank account in my name under a second address I had leased in Portugal. A quiet villa Robert and I once visited during our 35th anniversary trip. That villa, I learned, was available for long-term rent, and I had already paid the deposit. I hadn't told a soul, not even Denise yet, because some moves are made in silence. I packed gradually. A few personal items, important papers, clothes, and photographs. Every night I filled a small suitcase and set it aside in the hall closet. By the time Melissa noticed, I'd be gone. There was a moment, around the middle of the week, when I almost second-guessed myself. I was sitting in Robert's chair, holding his watch. I wondered what he would say if he knew what I was doing. Then I remembered his note. "Check everything. Don't trust Gavin." And I knew. This wasn't betrayal. This was fulfillment. I wasn't protecting money or property. I was protecting the final chapter of our life. The part he had written for me, not for them. Melissa wanted to inherit a story she didn't belong in, but I had lived it. I had earned it. So I kept smiling, kept pretending. And while they watched me sit in grief, I was quietly building my escape. On the surface, everything looked the same. I still answered Melissa's calls, still let her ramble about next steps, still acted like I was overwhelmed and just not ready yet to deal with the house. She believed me, because she wanted to. But behind the scenes, the trap was almost ready. It began with the house. Legally, it was now held in an irrevocable trust in my name. Carla had helped me draft the paperwork, and by the time Melissa brought it up again, "Have you thought about maybe downsizing?" I had already moved the deed, locked the trust, and filed a restriction of sale without my name and approval. The house was now bulletproof, untouchable. Next came the bank accounts. I had already transferred Robert's funds, including the offshore account, into secure accounts accessible only by me. The Belize account, the one Melissa didn't know existed, had enough in it to start over anywhere in the world. That was Robert's doing. He had opened it after a health scare nearly 10 years ago and told no one but Carla. He planned for everything, even this. Then came the personal items: Robert's watch, his cufflinks, the signed baseball from his childhood hero, the sealed letters he left for me, all quietly boxed, removed from the house, and stored in a safety deposit box across town under my name only. Melissa couldn't touch them even if she tried. It was the last week in the house when I put the final part of my plan into motion: the exit. I didn't want a dramatic goodbye. I didn't want a confrontation or shouting or tears. I wanted distance, peace, control. So I booked my flight, one way, Lisbon, Portugal. The villa Robert and I had visited years ago, the one with the blue shutters and the garden overlooking the Atlantic, had been available. I had quietly put down the deposit weeks earlier. I used Carla's help to transfer a portion of Robert's estate there, opening a local account and making sure my finances were invisible to anyone back home. Melissa wouldn't know where I went, not until I wanted her to. I left a letter with Carla, addressed to Melissa, to be delivered 2 days after my flight. Inside was a copy of Robert's will, the legal trust documentation, and a handwritten note that simply read, "This wasn't yours to take. It was never going to be. Mom." 2 days before I left, Melissa called again. "Have you had a chance to go through Dad's filing cabinet?" she asked. "Just wondering what's still there. Gavin and I can swing by this weekend to help sort things." I told her I appreciated her help but needed more time. I told her I wasn't ready. She offered to come over anyway, said we could just talk. Maybe go over next steps. She used that phrase a lot, next steps, as if my grief was just a series of project milestones she needed to manage. I politely declined. "Maybe next week," I said. "I just need a little more time." There wouldn't be a next week. That night, I cleaned the kitchen one last time. I folded the towel Robert always left by the sink. I wiped down the stove, closed the blinds, and stood in the middle of the living room just listening. It wasn't silence. Not really. It was closure. I set the suitcases by the front door and called a car for the airport. Before I left, I slipped one last envelope into the mailbox, addressed to Denise. It contained a spare key, a thank you note, and a photo of Robert and me on our anniversary. I told her she'd always be the only person who really understood what I had to do. Then I walked out without looking back. Melissa would wake up in 2 days and find her hands empty. There would be no furniture to divide, no accounts to access, no next steps to coordinate. Everything she thought she was circling had vanished. She thought I was grieving too hard to act, but while she made plans to take, I was already gone. 2 days after I left the country, the letter was delivered. I imagined Melissa opening it with her usual briskness, expecting a list of instructions or perhaps the keys to the house. Instead, she found the one thing she never anticipated, the end of her plan. Carla told me later how it unfolded. Melissa stormed into her office just hours after reading the letter. Gavin was with her, red-faced, loud, trying to intimidate with legalese he barely understood. "She can't just disappear like that," Melissa snapped, slamming the documents onto Carla's desk. "That house was supposed to be part of the estate." Carla remained calm. She had seen this type before. The entitled children, the grasping spouses, the carefully masked greed that unravels the moment money becomes real. "The house is in an irrevocable trust," Carla said smoothly, "created and filed under state law. It's not part of the estate anymore. It's under Irene's full control." Melissa's eyes narrowed. She's not thinking clearly. She's old. She's grieving. This wasn't what Dad wanted, but Carla was ready for that too. She slid a notarized letter across the desk, Robert's final instructions, signed and witnessed months before his death. In it, Robert wrote, "I want Irene to have peace. I trust her judgment completely. No one else is entitled to decide how she should live once I'm gone." Gavin leaned over Carla's desk, pointing a finger. "We'll sue. She's manipulating the will." But Carla only smiled. "Please do. I'll enjoy watching that case dissolve. Nothing has been altered. Everything was done legally and transparently. You're welcome to consult your own attorney." Melissa stood frozen. All her plans, all her calculations, undone by a woman she had underestimated from the start. She had tried to play grief like a strategy. She had confused mourning for weakness. She thought I was a silent, soft old woman who would hand over her life one item at a time. But grief didn't make me smaller. It made me sharper. From my villa in Portugal, I read Carla's update with a kind of quiet satisfaction. Not joy, not revenge, just closure. The message was clear. I had walked away on my terms. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't fought. I hadn't begged for understanding. I had simply taken what was mine, the life Robert and I built together, and chosen peace over permission. Melissa sent an email a week later. Subject: "You really just left?" Body: "I don't understand how you could do this. I thought we were supposed to go through this together. This is just cruel." I didn't reply, because there was nothing left to say. She hadn't asked me how I was feeling in weeks. She hadn't cried with me. She hadn't brought memories or comfort. All she had ever asked for was what she could take: the watch, the house, the assets, and now she had none of it. The final confrontation didn't need raised voices or a courtroom. It happened in the silence between her expectations and the reality I delivered. Weeks passed. Denise wrote to tell me that Melissa had stopped asking questions after the second attorney told her the same thing Carla had. Everything had been done by the book. There were no loopholes, no angles, just the ironclad truth of a woman who planned while they underestimated her. Gavin, apparently, had started dropping hints that maybe they had pushed too soon, too late for regret. They were left to sit with their disappointment, and I was left with my peace. I took long walks by the ocean, feeling the wind cut through my hair as I looked out over the water Robert and I had once stood beside. He had always talked about retiring here. Now I was finishing that dream, for both of us. Every sunset reminded me that love is quiet and lasting, not loud and transactional. Melissa wanted a fight. She wanted a battle she thought she'd already won. But I never raised my voice. I just left. And in doing so, I made my voice louder than any scream ever could. There was no applause, no grand moment of triumph, no dramatic phone call where Melissa apologized or begged for forgiveness. There was just silence, and it was beautiful. In Portugal, the days moved slowly. Mornings began with soft light spilling through gauzy curtains, followed by the sound of birdsong and the scent of ocean salt on the breeze. The villa Robert and I had once loved during our anniversary trip was exactly as I remembered. Tucked away on a quiet hill, with lemon trees in the yard and worn stone steps leading to the back garden. I spent the first week doing very little, just breathing, watching the light change across the tiled floor, sitting on the small terrace with tea in one hand and Robert's watch in the other. That watch, the one Melissa had asked for before his body was even in the ground, was never about money to me. It was time, frozen, memory, worn smooth by his skin. I didn't wear it. I simply kept it nearby, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Melissa didn't try to contact me again. After that one cold, confused email, she vanished from my inbox. I suppose once she realized there was nothing left to take, there was no reason to keep reaching out. I didn't mourn her absence. That may sound harsh, but the truth is, when someone shows you that your grief is an inconvenience to their ambition, you stop waiting for their love to feel like love. She didn't lose an inheritance. She lost something far more important: access. Access to my home, my trust, my future. Access to a mother who would have given her everything if she'd asked with a heart instead of hands. I started rebuilding in small, quiet ways. I joined a local book club, mostly women my age or older. We didn't talk about trauma or loss, just stories. Fictional characters became safe bridges back to conversation. I started sketching again, just pencil on paper, the way I used to before Melissa was born, before bills and meals and school drop-offs crowded out my time. I walked to the village market every Friday, bought fresh bread from a man who remembered Robert's name, picked up lavender from a woman who insisted I take extra for free. No one here knew me as the widow. I was just Irene, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt light. Some nights I sat by the small fire pit in the garden, wrapped in Robert's old cardigan, sipping warm tea and listening to the sea. That's where I began sorting through his letters. He had written them slowly over the last 6 months of his life. I found them tucked into a folder marked "For Irene After." There were 8 in total, 1 for each of our major anniversaries, 1 for the year Melissa was born, 1 for the year his business succeeded, and the last in a simple page titled "When You Need to Let Go." In that final letter, he wrote, "You are stronger than you think, Irene. You never needed me to protect you. I just love doing it. If they come for you, let them find nothing but your shadow. And when you walk away, don't look back. You deserve the kind of peace that doesn't come with permission." I cried that night, not from sadness, but from release. He had known, not just about Melissa, about me, about what I was capable of, about the weight I carried without ever naming it. I buried that letter beneath a stone in the garden, a small ritual just between us. I no longer checked my phone for messages. I stopped scanning my email for updates. There was nothing left to say to Melissa. No speech, no closure conversation. Sometimes, silence is the full sentence. My quiet victory wasn't about money. It wasn't about winning. It was about reclaiming the space to exist without being managed, judged, or used. It was about finding joy in a world I had built, not one they thought they could inherit. Melissa faded into the background like an echo in a house I no longer lived in. And I stepped forward, finally free, finally whole, finally mine. One evening, months after I had arrived in Portugal, I found myself walking the shoreline at dusk. The ocean was quiet, the tide lapping at the sand in gentle rhythm like a heartbeat finally at rest. The sky was painted in soft purples and faded golds, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a woman escaping something. I felt like a woman returning. I carried Robert's watch in my hand. I didn't wear it. I never had. But I kept it close, the same way you hold on to something that can't be replaced. Not because of its value, but because of its weight. It was warm in my palm from the walk. I sat on a weathered stone bench near the edge of the bluff. This was the very spot where Robert and I had once watched the sun go down on our anniversary. Years ago, before his diagnosis, before Melissa's ambition cast shadows on everything. That night had been filled with laughter. We drank too much wine, danced to music only we could hear, and talked about the idea of retiring here someday. We didn't talk about logistics or money or who would inherit what. We talked about what life could feel like if we ever slowed down enough to breathe it in. And now, here I was. Alone, yes, but not lonely. In the stillness, I thought about all that had happened, about the funeral, about Melissa's whisper at the casket. Can I have his watch? About the documents, the betrayal, the plans made behind my back, about the strength I didn't know I had until I was forced to find it. I thought about how quiet my victory had been. No screaming, no legal battles, no revenge, just one clean move, and a door quietly shut behind me. People think walking away is the dramatic part, but it's not. The real power is in what you leave behind. I didn't leave because I wanted revenge. I left because I realized there was nothing left for me in that house, nothing but memories now stained by the quiet greed of someone I once held as an infant. Melissa had mistaken inheritance for entitlement. She thought biology earned her access. But love isn't written in a will. It's built, day by the choices we make, and she chose distance long before I did. I still loved her, in my own quiet, complicated way, but I no longer felt the need to prove it. That love now had boundaries, the kind that protect, not punish. As the sun began to dip lower on the horizon, I pressed the watch to my heart for a moment, then placed it gently into the small velvet pouch I kept in my coat pocket. I didn't cry. Instead, I whispered, "I kept my promise, Robert." And I had. I had protected everything you trusted me with, not just the money, not just the house, but the essence of the life we built. And now I was living the part you wanted for me, the part with peace, with simplicity, with space to breathe and just be. I stayed on that bench until the last line of the sun disappeared behind the waves. Then I walked back to the villa, where fresh flowers waited on the windowsill and the kettle hummed on the stove. The next morning, I wrote a letter. Not to Melissa, not to anyone really, just a note for myself. It said, "You are not what was taken from you. You are what you saved. I folded it and placed it inside the leather-bound journal Robert had gifted me years ago, still mostly empty, waiting for new stories. I think I'll begin writing them now, not about loss or betrayal or survival, but about what comes after. The slow, quiet building of a life that no one else gets to design but me.